Welcome back to another Kray video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any videos. And for people really into the Krays, join our private Facebook group, Krays Crime Lords of London, where you will find stuff probably unavailable anywhere else. We're an established group with a large membership, and best of all, we're friendly. The link is in the YouTube description section.
Good evening. Last week we opened this series on Life with Crime with an interview with a former notorious criminal, John McVicker. Tonight we talk to a member of that profession whose job it is to visit the scene of the crime, find out who committed it, and then arrest and charge them. In other words, the CID. My guest this evening has had a lifetime of experience in detective work. Leonard Nipper Reed started on the beat in London in 1947. Soon after, he transferred into the plainclothes division and has since been responsible for the arrest and conviction of many criminals, his most famous case being the capture of the Kray brothers. In 1972, he was given the country's top CID job as head of the powerful regional crime squad, and in 1976, he was awarded the Queen's Police Medal after being commended for his work 16 times. He is now security advisor to the National Gallery and Museums. Mr. Reed, what made you become a policeman?
Well, it was a mixture of things, really. I'd served in the Navy. Before that, I'd been in a factory, in Players Factory, in fact, in Nottingham. Then I served in the Navy, which gave me an entirely different view of life, more freedom and so on. And I was convinced that there was no way that I was going to work back in a factory. And so I decided on the police force because it was a career. And secondly, because at that time it held out a very attractive prospect of having a pension with the job. And so that really was what attracted me. But of course, I was limited in where I could go, and that's why I came in the Metropolitan, because of the height problem.
Well, I was going to ask you, what about the nickname Nipper? How did that come about?
Well, for two reasons, really, I think. One, because of my height, because I was rather short, always very short at school. And so I got the nickname Titch or Nipper then. And then when I joined the service, the police service, I was amongst much taller people, and so it continued, and it's stuck with me ever since.
Now, I understand as a young man you were quite a boxer, weren't you?
Yes, I was. For 3 years I was the police champion boxer, and that, of course, was another reason why the name of Nipper was perpetuated.
Now, did this boxing skill of yours come in handy at any time when you were engaged in arresting criminals? I mean, were you ever engaged in any rough stuff?
Well, fortunately, not too much, but there was one occasion when I was arresting a man who was trying to escape from police custody in a police station yard. And I started a fight with him, and eventually managed to overcome him, and he was taken back into custody. But sometime later, I realised that I'd lost my skill at boxing because I'd broken the knuckles in both of my hands.
On this occasion?
On this occasion, yes.
Now, you've been in the detective branch for most of your career. Has the pattern of crime and criminality changed at all during your time?
Well, it's changed enormously and very obviously. I mean, in volume it's changed, completely changed. I mean, it's increased so much that it's quite disproportionate. But also it's changed in the physical violence that's involved in crime. Because when I started as a detective, the housebreaker was an entirely different kettle of fish from the man that we get today. In my day, he wouldn't naturally resort to violence. He wanted to do his work. He wanted to be as professional as he possibly could. He didn't want to get caught, obviously. But if he was caught, then in the majority of cases anyway, he would surrender. He would see that there was no means of escape. He would try to talk his way out of something. If he was stopped by a householder or someone that appeared to be an authority other than a policeman, he tried to talk his way out. But invariably, when he was finally and positively captured, then he would say, well, that's it. It was the old thing about being a fair cop governor.
Now, with modern methods of detection, is it easier or is it harder to catch criminals these days?
Well, it's easier in the sense that they've got a better backup. They've got more technical resources to call up. You know, in the sense that in my day we didn't have the computerized records that they've got. We didn't have the scenes of crimes officers they've got, the photographers, the fingerprint experts, and so on. We used to do most of that ourselves. We would search a scene and dust for fingerprints and so on. But because of the proliferation of crime and the number of people that are resorting to a crime, I don't think they've got the same facility that we had, which was possibly to be able to distinguish who's committed the crime because of the type of crime that it was. There's such an abundance of crime.
Now, you mentioned violence, the increased violence, a moment ago, and of course the British police always prided themselves on being unarmed.
Yes.
Do you think there's now a case, with the fact many criminals use guns these days, of the police being armed?
Well, I feel that it's inevitable that the police will be armed. I think it would be a tragedy, and so do the policemen. The ordinary policemen, the majority of senior policemen feel this too. They don't want to be armed. But you see, they're in a situation where it's ludicrous to expect them to go into a situation where they're facing an armed and desperate criminal. Why should the British public ask them to do this? And I don't think it's fair, I don't think it's right. But they would hate to be forced into a situation where they would have to be armed as a matter of course. At the moment they resent it, and I personally think that it's a backward step, because that's not what British policing was all about.
Were there any criminals in your career that you got to know and did cases with that you liked?
There were certainly some. I mean, the con men were the people that always commanded respect, in my view. I mean, they were still criminals, of course, and they created havoc. But nevertheless, they were a different breed. They were not totally non-violent, and they would always say that an insurance company would pay for what they'd done, or that there was justification for what they'd done. Of course, there never was, but nevertheless, they tried to justify their misdeeds in that fashion. But they were a different breed from those that resorted to violence.
Didn't you know a con man who swallowed a razor blade or something?
Oh, indeed.
Yeah.
This was a man who had stolen some luggage. He did this in a very plausible fashion, but he'd stolen some luggage, and eventually all he wanted really was a checkbook, and he'd gone off to the Waldorf Hotel, and he'd gone through the luggage and found the checkbook, and he ordered a large meal and some wine and so on, and he was perfectly satisfied that that's all he wanted. But what he didn't realise was that there was a great hue and cry, because he'd actually stolen something from an American officer that was supposed to have contained some secret papers. In point of fact, it didn't. But nevertheless, he was arrested eventually. There was a big hue and cry, and he was arrested. He was taken to the police station and charged. And very shortly afterwards, he called the station officer and said, "Look, I think you ought to get an ambulance because I swallowed a razor blade." And he had. And this was something that he did fairly regularly. Whenever he was arrested, in order to acclimatise him for the rigours of prison, after the nice, soft and very comfortable life that he'd been leading, he would swallow a razor blade, go into prison for a couple of weeks while this thing was eventually removed from him, and quite enjoy himself.
His tummy must have had a lot of scars on it.
Indeed, yes, but this is something that he did quite often.
Now, one reads a lot about detectives being offered bribes, and in some cases accepting bribes from criminals. How common is that?
Well, it must be fairly common, because we've seen evidence of this through the courts and so on. But I can only remember on a couple of occasions that people have offered me bribes, and these were very tentative approaches, no more than that. They weren't really positive attempts to bribe me. They were feeling their way.
Did you ever feel tempted to accept?
Well, there was no question about it. There was no question about it at all, because it's a question of training and background, I think. I was very fortunate because I was trained by a man that knew all the pitfalls that a young detective might fall into, and so I benefited from that, and so there was never any reason or necessity to do it, in my view.
Mr. Reid, I understand that in the course of your investigations, you sometimes, perhaps quite often, used to put on a disguise. Is that true?
Yes, it is. And I used to do this from a very early age, from the time that I first started as a detective, because I thought it was essential. A detective has to have this chameleon-like quality to be able to melt into the background and to be discreet. Because my view is that a criminal that's actually on the street doing some kind of misdeed can see you twice. Once he'll barely notice you. He's always suspicious, of course. The next time he will notice you. And so you mustn't be able to see you more than those number of times. So I adopted various disguises.
Well, I was going to say, what kind of disguise?
Well, as a railway porter when I was doing an observation in a public house that was frequented by railwomen, as a milkman when we raided premises to arrest an escaped burglar, and as a parson in order to make my way into the prison chapel where I was interviewing criminals who were very courageously, in my view, telling me tales about the Kray brothers and others in that organisation.
You went in as a parson?
Yes.
And then what did you do? Did you interrogate people in there?
Well, they were making statements, you see. They wanted to make statements about their relationship with the organisation and what they had done and what the Krays had done. Yeah. And so this was really the only venue that was sacrosanct in every sense, and where they could safely make their statement to me without the knowledge of their fellow prisoners.
Did you record these statements?
Oh, indeed, indeed. I was always conscious of the fact that in that situation at that time, there was a very strong possibility that I, to use the phrase, would be fitted up. In other words, that I would be getting statements from them under duress.
But if a parson goes into a prison carrying a tape recorder,
yes,
he's rather suspect, isn't
Well,
he?
indeed, it would have been. But you see, what I did was this. I had a box file that I filled with foam rubber and put my tape recorder in that and the microphone. And then the outside of the box file had a little label which said Songs of Praise. So this was very interesting.
How much does a detective have to rely on informers?
Well, to an inordinate degree, really, because they are the only people that know exactly what's going on, apart from the criminal himself. And so you need to cultivate people like that in order to get the kind of first-hand information which is so very essential.
What is the going rate for informers?
Well, that depends, of course, on the quality and the success rate of the actual job. It could be £100, it could be £200, it could be £1,000, but it would depend on the number of people arrested, the property recovered, and so on.
What do you think of the advent of what I think are now called supergrasses, people like Bertie Smalls, who I believe you knew?
Yes. Well, again, he, for example, was essential in that investigation because he was the only common thread through all the offences that were committed, and so therefore he was the only one in a position to inform on his colleagues. Whether it's a nice thing or not is not in question. It's a terrible thing. I mean, it's something that has been distasteful from the very first one, Judas. They've always been very unsavoury characters, but nevertheless essential people because, as I said, they know what's going on. And the supergrass has been recognised, I suppose, not officially as a matter of policy, but the police and the Home Office and the prison authorities have recognised that they should have some kind of special treatment. They get a reduction in their sentence because they are responsible. I mean, Smalls, I think, informed on something like 200 people. They got 300 years imprisonment, something of that order, which is quite incredible. And so the balance is adjusted in the sense that had he not informed, it may have been that he or the others would have escaped justice and so on.
Isn't there a danger, though, of informants setting up a crime in order to make money from it?
This has happened, yes, and this is always the danger. This is where it's so important that the detective must control his informant. There must be a discipline, because otherwise the informant may well be wants to set up somebody falsely and maliciously in order to get information, money, from the detective.
Now, your most famous case, I think you would probably agree, was that of the Kray brothers. Did this pose any particular problems for you?
Well, it did, because the important thing there was to guard against infiltration from people in the service and who might pass on information back to the Krays. And so it's essential there that the team should be handpicked and also that it should be in a situation that was removed from Scotland Yard, and this we eventually succeeded in.
How did you actually nail them? Because, I mean, they were tough people, they knew what the law was, they weren't going to give in easily. How did you actually manage to nail them?
Well, What I did, in fact, was to go into the middle of them. It was useless, I knew from experience, trying to get their victims, the victims of their violence, to make statements against them, because the thought was that the Krays would never be arrested, that they were protected by some divine spirit. And so the only way, really, to try to get evidence against them was to go right in the middle and find one of their co-conspirators, one of their associates, who, for one reason or another, had fallen into disrepute. And that's what I did. I found a man who had had an argument with the Krays. He'd known them for a long period of time. He'd known about all their activities. He was a con man who tried to control and direct them, in fact. And so eventually, after a couple of confidence-building interviews, I managed to persuade him to give testimony, and he made a very long statement about all their activities. And this really was the start, the key that opened the door to the inquiry into the Krays.
When you say you had interviews with him, did you bring him into the yard, or did you go and see him at his place?
Oh, good heavens, no. We went miles away into all kinds of small hotels and this kind of thing, where it was very discreet and where people wouldn't realise who we were and so on. We hired a room and we spent hours going through all the evidence that he was able to give and so on.
Is it true that the Kray brothers had a price on your head of £5,000?
Yes, it was. In fact, this we learned from one of their fellow prisoners, who made a statement eventually and said that that was the going rate then for someone to come over from America and do the business on me.
And do you? Did this worry you?
Well, it did, of course it did. It didn't for a time, because threats like this are not uncommon from criminals, but these were a different breed. They were men of violence, obviously, and so because of that, I think I took it more seriously.
Did you carry a gun at that time?
No, I didn't. Occasionally I did, but not as a matter of routine.
Mr. Reed, what do you think of the very long sentences that are being meted out nowadays to hardened criminals? For instance, the train robbery case in which you were also involved, I mean, there were sentences of 30 years.
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
Well, I think that long sentences like that are totally unjustified. I don't think that... I think it breaks a man's character completely to serve a sentence like that.
Now, you're on record as saying that you would like to see crime statistics published on a basis of race. Is that not being anti-racial?
No, I don't think it is, because when I said that, what I meant by that was that I'd like to identify the problem. What is being suggested is that it's racist, but you see, there are problems in places like Brixton and Bradford and Birmingham and Southall and so on. And we know that black youths are getting into trouble because they don't have work, or because of their bad environment, or because of lack of educational work, for whatever reason. Why shouldn't we identify that and do something positive about it, rather than saying it's not happening, it'll go away?
But is the thinking behind that there are far more crimes committed by coloured people than the general public know about? Is that what the thinking is behind that wish?
I think it's probably true, yes. I think it ought to be identified, and if it's a problem, then we can look at it.
Yeah. When you take a man into questioning, how do you get him to talk?
Well, if a man's determined not to talk, you can't get him to talk. For example, I mean, you can't beat a confession from a man. That's absolutely impossible. So, really, it's a question of trying to indicate to him the kind of evidence that you've got, indicate to him the evidence that is against him personally, be it fingerprints, or the fact that he was seen by a witness, or the fact that you've recovered property from his address, or that he's been named by a co-conspirator, or something of that order, and then see what his reaction is. And there's nothing more than that to it, really.
I mean, do you use the kind of techniques one sometimes reads about of blowing hot and cold, leaving him for an hour or two, coming back for 5 minutes, leaving him for another hour? I mean, are these sort of techniques used?
They are used without any question, but personally I didn't bother with that too much, because I think that what you've got to do is try to get some determination about the man himself, to quickly gauge the calibre of the person that you're interrogating, so that you know whether you're going to be successful in getting him to talk or not, whether you're wasting your time. And I think that in a fairly quick and brief interview you can determine that, and then you know whether to go on or not.
What is your view about the accused person's right to silence, and the fact that, by law, the detective is obliged to tell him that he doesn't have to say anything unless he wants to? What's your view of that?
Well, the caution, I personally think the caution is a waste of time, because most of the people that are cautioned don't realise they've been cautioned. You know, they're in a very traumatic state. They're in a police station maybe for the first time in their lives, and they see this person in authority intoning this business about not having to say anything unless they wish to do so. There is the possibility always that a completely innocent man may not say something which would extricate him from the actual crime. But the hardened professional criminal, it makes no difference to him at all. He's heard it so many times that he would say, and very often has said to me, "Don't waste the time telling me that, Governor," and this kind of thing. But the right of silence, I think some indication should be taken of this by the court, because people should be persuaded in one fashion or another by pressure, by indicating to the court that this man didn't say anything in reaction to the charge when it was laid against him, or the question that was posed by the detective, and so on. Because it's never protected the innocent person, it's always been a shield for the guilty, and that's all.
Yeah. Now, we've also heard a very great deal recently about what's called the verbals. That's to say, allegations that police officers have put into the accused's mouth, things that he didn't say. And indeed, last week we had John McVicar here, and he alleged that in, I think, most of the crimes he committed, while admitting he was guilty, he said that he'd been verbaled. Now, verbaling goes on, we all know that. Now, is it done because the police often know that a man is guilty, yet haven't got the evidence to nail him? Is that the reason for it?
In fact, I was just about to ask you that. I wonder whether John McVicar had been convicted merely on the evidence of verbals, or whether there was substantial evidence to back it up.
Oh yes, he would admit there was, and
yes.
He doesn't deny that he was guilty, but he says that there were occasions, and indeed there are many, many instances which I could quote to you of where there have been verbals. And what I wanted to get from you was why it is done, when it's done. Is it because a lack of evidence and a feeling, well, we know this man did it, but we can't get him otherwise?
I'm sure that's the case. I'm sure that the situation is that there's a paucity of evidence against a particular individual, and so in order to just redress the balance a little bit, an officer will go to the extreme of verbaling a man and putting into his mouth words that he didn't say, which indicate that he committed the crime.
Mr. Reid, have you ever verbaled anybody?
I've never needed to. No. I've never needed to, because it's amazing what people say when they're arrested. It truly is. And always I think, personally, that it's bad detective work. If you can't get the evidence, then you can't charge a person, and it's as simple as that.
What do you say to the suggestion that interrogations should be tape recorded?
Well, personally, I'm a very great believer in this. I think very strongly that it should be. It's a precaution that I've taken myself on many occasions, and it served me in very good stead. I've already told you.
You've just done it privately.
Privately, yeah. Without any authority at all, and it had no legal standing in court, but it served me in good stead in one particular case that I can recall, where I'd tape recorded surreptitiously a conversation that I'd had with a man who'd made some very startling admissions. And I, of course, gave this in evidence, or at least started to give it in evidence, but his lawyer stopped this, and there was the inevitable trial within a trial, while the judge, in the absence of the jury, tried to decide whether the evidence should be admitted to the jury. And this went on until lunchtime, and at the lunchtime break I spoke to his counsel, who I knew, and said, if you could be here at 10 minutes to 2, I can let you listen to something. And I let him listen to a passage on this tape recording of the actual conversation that we'd had, and he realised that everything that I was saying was perfectly true. And so he withdrew the objections, the case went on, and my evidence was heard. But I think that it should be tape recorded, because it's a protection. It indicates exactly what the conversation between the prisoner and the detective was, and in fact my view is that they should be videotaped.
It has been suggested that when a criminal, yes, of course, if it was videotaped, this wouldn't happen, what I'm going to suggest to you, but it has been suggested that if a criminal knows that his interrogation is going to be tape recorded, he will be tempted to say halfway through it, "Oh, stop twisting my arm, Gov, you're hurting me."
That's one of the problems, of course. But if it were videotaped from the very beginning, this would obviate that possibility at all, and that's what I think.
Do you agree with Sir David McNee, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, that the police should be given wider powers?
Well, they should, but the problem that I think that we're facing is that the question of what the public reaction will be, because there is no way that the police in this country can operate without the total support of the general public. And when Sir David suggests that he wants prisoners or suspects to be able to be locked up in a police station for 72 hours. I dread to think what the public reaction would be. We know that at the moment suspects are kept for 24 hours, and they can be kept for longer if there's a good reason, and they can go before a court and so on. But 72 hours sounds a long time. The temptation might always be to keep them up to the maximum period. And of course the other thing is that it will only be necessary to use that power on a very limited number of occasions. But if it's there in writing and it's an authoritative situation, the general public will feel that it's used far more often than it probably is.
Now, Mr. Reid, you were at the yard at the time that several hundred police officers were either sacked or had to retire or resign because of corruption. Did that come as a surprise to you?
Well, the fact that there was corruption in the police force didn't, because it was apparent that there was some measure of corruption. But certainly when the revelation was made, I was absolutely horrified at the extent of it, because, and I think everyone concerned was, all the people that were doing the investigation were horrified.
In fact, I think, as you said earlier, when you were investigating the Kray case, you were so worried about bent police officers getting back to the Krays, what you were doing, that you moved your headquarters somewhere else.
Yes, indeed. That's right. That's absolutely right.
Does it surprise you that several years after that event happened, there are still, I think, some 60 officers at the present time under investigation?
It does surprise me, and it surprised me, as I've said, the extent and the of that corruption, because I would have thought one example would have been enough to deter anyone. And yet there are still cases under investigation. People are still appearing before the courts on most serious charges of corruption. And I'm absolutely astounded that they don't take cognizance of what's happened before and just not do it.
Is it because the rewards of corruption, that's to say the money that's now involved in crime, millions a year, are something which are put in the police's way, and which are not put in my way or normal people's way? It's put in their way, and this that they find hard to resist. Is this what it is?
I would have said a few years ago no, because I never appreciated that there was that kind of money available to bribe policemen. But listening to some of the evidence and reading about the evidence in some of the recent cases, then it was very obvious that there wasn't an inordinate amount of money available for that very purpose. So I suppose that if a detective or a police officer of any kind is in a situation where somebody says to him, well, look, that is what I can give you, the temptation he's got then to make the decision, yes or no. And it must be very tempting to him, I suppose, if he's inclined that way at all.
Do you think that in fields like drugs, especially marijuana, and the selling of pornographic literature, the law could be changed to make corruption less possible for policemen?
I think it certainly could in the case of pornography, because that's one of the dangerous areas. That's one of the problems that resulted in the arrest of so many officers before in what was called the Dirty Book Squad. And certainly I think there that a new look should be taken to that, to legalise pornography in one way or another.
Let's shift from corrupt policemen to corrupt lawyers. Sir Robert Mark has said on several occasions that there are bent lawyers. Have you come across them in your experience?
Well, not, again, in the sense that I could prefer charges against them or produce a massive evidence, but certainly enough to make me very suspicious of them and to indicate to persons in authority that their future cases should be watched.
Looking at what you described earlier as an enormous increase in crime since you first became a detective, have you thought, as a result of your experience, of any ways at all in which crime could be reduced?
Society's got to change. There's got to be a rethink about society. People have got to decide what kind of society they want to live in, whether they are content to live in this society where so many people commit crime, where they allow so much crime to proliferate, or whether they want a more orderly society with a decent British type of police force, rather than the kind of thing we were talking about earlier, an armed paramilitary organisation.
Of course, when you started your career, there was a stigma attached to crime and the criminal, wasn't there? Right. And I wouldn't say there was so much now.
It's gone now. You see, that was a social barrier. People who were involved with the police or went to court or went to prison, there was that. They were totally stigmatised for a very long time, and so were their children and their family. And the result of that was that people were reluctant to become involved in crime. Now that's all gone. That's completely removed, and people don't seem to worry. In fact, it's par for the course almost that a young kid goes to a juvenile court or goes to a remand home, and it's considered something of an accolade in their particular circle and so on.
Lastly, Mr. Reid, I've heard it said that detectives and criminals are really two sides of the same coin. That a man who chooses to become a policeman might perhaps have chosen to become a criminal. Is that a fanciful idea, or is there any truth in it?
Well, it's often been said, you know, you set a thief to catch a thief. You've got to be almost a criminal to be a detective. I don't think that's right. It may have been right in the old Bow Street days, but certainly not in these days, where we've got to know the criminals. We've got to know their background, the way they feel, the way they think. And likewise, they would want to do the same with us, because we're their very apparent adversary. But I don't think you need to get too involved and embroiled in the criminal underworld to be a successful detective.
And you, Mr. Reid, never thought yourself of becoming a criminal?
No, I didn't, thank goodness.
Thank you very much.